one of the things I've needed to think about, as well as the aggregation for anonymity and making sure the data is anonymised so the police would be confident about how I'll be using their sensitive data, is what will happen when I come to publish the data, when I come to put it in various papers and publications. And I've actually, what sort of scale do I need to think about that? Now, I am running focus groups, and in that case it's fairly straightforward. With running the focus groups, I've got those involved in the focus groups to sign a piece of paper that say I consent to this being used in various ways, including various publications, so they know what's happening. With my police crime data, there's no way I could go to everybody who's possibly been a victim of crime or offence or whatever and say, do you mind if I use this data for this area? There's also another very specific issue when you're dealing with crime data, and that's the problem with, are you going to stigmatise the area by the nature of the maps you're using, by showing an area as being a high crime area? Is that a problem? And that's something I'm still thinking about with my data. Now, at the moment, the way when I've presented the data at conferences, I've presented it in such a way that it's aggregated up at a scale where it's actually very difficult to see where the area is. I haven't specifically said where the area is, and I haven't provided any context below these sort of various heat maps and other maps I'm using, like railway stations or roads or anything like that, that makes it very easy to tell where the data is. I've also not included the boundaries of output areas because they actually run along roads, so I've taken them off and just left the shading in place and done various techniques that make it a little more difficult to identify where the area is. The other thing I'm going to be doing is feeding back the research to the police before final publication in some presentations, and I'm going to discuss with them again about what might be the issues in talking about some of these areas. Some of the areas are areas that have undergone quite a lot of regeneration. They're areas which are perhaps working to change their image a little. They might not want to be yet again shown in a publication of being an area with a high crime problem, for example. So you need to think about, is that a problem, and how do you think about that? And that's something I'm going to be having ongoing discussions with my supervisors and my suppliers. In my case at the moment, the way I'm showing the data, I'm confident that I'm keeping fairly anonymous precisely where the areas are. As I come to finally publishing my work, I may wish to talk about specific issues which may involve further identification of areas, and that's something I'll have further discussions with supervisors and with my data suppliers, the police, about. But it is, I think, something you need to keep in mind. Is there a possibility that you can show an area in a particular light with the data that you're using that might actually reflect negatively or positively on that area? And are there any ethical issues you need to think about in that respect? Does it raise any issues? I mean, it's something I raised. I had to write an ethics proposal at the start of this, and it is something I raised and said I would aggregate the data at such a level to try and avoid certainly the identification of individual streets, and that's still something I'm going to very much avoid. When I've had conversations with police, they've sometimes identified individual shops or quite precise locations which they see as being problematic, and that's something I won't actually be specifically mentioning. But it is an issue for publication. You need to think about, well, what data, if I publish this at a very fine scale, yet might show something very interesting, but then does that suddenly suggest that this particular street has a particular problem? And you may not have all the information around what's been going on in that area. You might miss some interesting context that you might not have, and just publishing the numbers might think, oh, this is an area with a huge problem. And in fact, there may be very specific things that have happened to that area that you don't know about. So it is something you have to be quite careful about. I'm partly controlling for that by having these focus groups with police where I'm getting to tell me information about the local area. So they've been able to tell me some specific things that are happening in local areas, and I'm able to quote that because, again, I've got their consent to quote things they're telling me in the focus group. So that's helping me by providing some context to the local area. So I may be confident that I might be able to give some additional information which might identify areas more precisely than I'm doing now. But it is a key issue to think about as you publish your data. What information about this area are you prepared to give, and how is your work presenting the area? What effect is it having on them? With the obvious example, I have an example when I was teaching, and I had some crime data which is publicly available. It's at quite a broad scale, and the students were using it, and one of the students said to me afterwards, oh, you know that crime data we used in it, I had a quick look to see where I should live or not. And so, I mean, and actually the crime data didn't necessarily show you an area was bad, but people might think, oh, high crime, bad area. And so you need to just think a little bit about this information you're presenting. How does it reflect on the area? Is that a problem? Do you need to be more careful about how you're presenting stuff? Do you perhaps, never mind the anonymising at an individual level, do you need to anonymise it a bit to keep the area anonymous, or maybe specific streets in that area anonymous?